You don't get to sit there. The words cracked through the low hum of breakfast chatter like a gavel striking wood, sharp enough to silence the scrape of forks against porcelain and the hiss of bacon on the griddle. Sheriff Daniel Hayes stood near the counter of Rosie's diner, his tin uniform pressed crisp, silver badge catching the morning sun that filtered through the wide front windows. Outside, Main Street was waking up slow, pickup trucks angled along the curb, a church steeple casting a long shadow across the sidewalk. Inside, every head had turned toward the corner booth by the window where 72-year-old Mrs. Evelyn Carter sat, with a white ceramic mug cradled between both hands. Steam curled up toward her face, softening the deep lines etched by time and Georgia summers and winters that bit colder than people expected. She wore a pale blue cardigan despite the late August heat, the sleeves pushed carefully to her wrists to hide the tremor that came with arthritis. She had ordered the same thing she had ordered every Saturday for the past 10 years. One scrambled egg, dry wheat toast, and black coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention. Just a quiet ritual. Sheriff Hayes stepped closer, boots heavy against the checkerboard tile. I said, you don't get to sit there. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. A waitress behind the counter froze mid-pour, the coffee pot suspended in the air. A teenage busboy stopped stacking plates. The old jukebox in the corner kept playing Patsy Cline, unaware that the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Mrs. Carter looked up slowly, not startled, not confused, just tired in a way that went beyond sleep. The sunlight caught the silver in her hair, pulled back neatly at the nape of her neck. I've been sitting here for years, she said, her voice steady, soft like worn leather. This booth faces the flag outside. Through the window, the American flag in front of City Hall rippled gently in the late summer breeze. Sheriff Hayes followed her gaze and then looked back at her as if she had missed the point entirely. That's not the issue. He gestured vaguely toward the room, toward the invisible lines that some people in town still believed were etched into the floor. A couple in their 40s stared down at their pancakes. An elderly white man at the counter cleared his throat, but said nothing. Silence, thick and heavy, pressed against the walls. Mrs. Carter set her mug down carefully on its saucer, aligning it just so. Her hands were thin, veins raised like faint blue rivers beneath her dark skin. She had lived in this town long enough to know the rhythm of confrontation, long enough to measure a man by the way he filled a doorway. Sheriff Hayes filled it completely. You're causing a disturbance, he continued, though no one had spoken but him. We've had complaints. The lie hung there, fragile and obvious. Mrs. Carter glanced around the diner, meeting eyes that quickly darted away. I'm eating breakfast, she replied. That's all. The sheriff's jaw tightened. His radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, a reminder of authority humming at all times. Ma'am, I won't ask again. He placed his hand flat on the edge of the table, close enough to rattle the salt and pepper shakers. The small American flag tucked into the sugar caddy trembled. Mrs. Carter inhaled slowly, as if drawing in not just air but decades of memory. This diner had once refused her husband's service in 1964. He had worn his army uniform that day, home on leave, proud and barely 23. He had stood tall anyway. She remembered that. She remembered standing beside him. My husband served this country, she said quietly. Korea. Came back with a Purple Heart and a limp that never healed right. Sheriff Hayes shifted his weight, impatience flickering across his face. That has nothing to do with today. But it did. The flag outside snapped once in the wind, a sharp sound that made a few people flinch. Mrs. Carter reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a folded photograph, edges softened from years of being handled. She placed it on the table between them, a young black soldier in uniform, smiling at a future he believed would welcome him home. It has everything to do with today, she said. The sheriff glanced at the photo but did not pick it up. The badge on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, polished and proud. For a moment, the entire diner felt like it was holding its breath, suspended between past and present, between who this town said it was and who it chose to be when no one important was watching. Mrs. Carter did not move from her seat. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat, shoulders squared, eyes clear, facing a man who believed a uniform made him taller than history. The clock above the pie case ticked loud enough to be heard now, each second landing like a reminder that time did not pause for discomfort. Sheriff Hayes kept his hand planted on the edge of the table, but he did not move closer. He did not need to. His presence filled the booth as surely as any physical step could. Mrs. Evelyn Carter sat upright, shoulders drawn back beneath her pale blue cardigan, her eyes steady in a way that did not challenge, did not provoke, but did not retreat either. Around them, the scent of fresh biscuits and fried bacon lingered in the air, warm and familiar, as though the diner itself refused to acknowledge the tension gathering inside its walls. A pickup truck rumbled past outside, bass from a country radio station faint through the glass. Inside, no one reached for their food. The waitress slowly set the coffee pot back on the burner without pouring another cup. Sheriff Hayes glanced toward the counter where Rosie, the owner, stood frozen behind her register. Rosie had known Evelyn for decades. She had attended the funeral when Evelyn's husband passed. But she also knew what it meant to live in a town where the sheriff decided who got inspected, who got cited, whose parking lot suddenly failed a safety review. Power in small towns did not shout. It leaned in quietly. "Ma'am," Hayes said again, voice measured, "this booth is reserved." His eyes flicked briefly to the American flag outside, as if it were an accessory rather than a symbol. Mrs. Carter looked at the laminated tabletop, her fingertips resting lightly near the folded photograph. "Reserved for who?" she asked gently. The sheriff hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for the silence to stretch. A deputy near the door shifted his stance, uncertain. There was no sign taped to the window, no placard on the table, no policy written anywhere that could be pointed to without embarrassment. "Reserved for people who understand how things work here," Hayes replied at last. It was not an answer. It was a warning wrapped in vagueness. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed together, not in fear, but in recognition. She had grown up with phrases like that. Phrases that floated above laws, but weighed more than any statute. She reached slowly for her purse again, not hurried, not defensive. From inside, she pulled out a small envelope, edges worn from being carried too long. She did not open it. She simply laid it beside the photograph. The return address read Arlington, Virginia. The paper was thick, official, the kind that carried government seals embossed faintly into the corner. Sheriff Hayes noticed it. His gaze lingered for a beat before he looked back at her face. "I come here every Saturday," she said softly. "I sit here because my husband liked to watch that flag wave while he ate." Said it reminded him what he believed in. The jukebox song ended, replaced by a brief crackle of static before another tune began. The normal rhythm of the diner tried to resume, but no one reached for a fork. Hayes exhaled through his nose, impatience tightening his posture. "This is not about your husband," he said. "It is about maintaining order." Mrs. Carter nodded once, as if she had heard that reasoning before too. "Order," she repeated, almost to herself. She glanced around the diner, at the people who had shared sidewalks and school events and church pews with her for years. Some faces showed discomfort. Some showed resignation. A few showed something like shame. Outside, the sun climbed higher, bright against the courthouse bricks down the street. The American flag snapped again in the breeze, bold and unbothered. Mrs. Carter folded her hands atop the table, the envelope and the photograph resting between her fingers like quiet witnesses. "I am not disturbing anyone," she said. "I am not raising my voice. I am not breaking any law." Her eyes met his evenly. "I am simply sitting." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the distant whir of a ceiling fan struggling against the late summer heat. Sheriff Hayes studied her, as though trying to measure the weight of something he did not yet understand. The deputy near the door glanced once more at the envelope, then at the badge on his superior's chest. In that narrow space between command and conscience, the air felt thinner, harder to breathe. The sheriff's gaze shifted from the envelope to the photograph and back again, calculations settling behind his eyes like a storm cloud that had not yet decided whether to break. He straightened slowly, withdrawing his hand from the table as though the polished surface had grown warmer than expected. The deputy near the door adjusted his belt, the leather creaking in the quiet. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past City Hall, its brakes releasing a long sigh of air that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside Rosie's diner, the air conditioner hummed steadily, fighting the late August heat that pressed against the windows. Mrs. Evelyn Carter did not touch the envelope again. She did not need to. It rested there, official and unassuming, the Arlington return address visible without being displayed. Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat. "You are making this into something it does not need to be," he said, lowering his voice as if privacy could restore control. Mrs. Carter tilted her head slightly. "I am not the one who stood up," she replied. Her tone remained calm, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it, the kind forged not in anger but in endurance. A spoon clinked against a cup at the counter when an elderly patron's hand trembled. He set it down quickly, eyes fixed on the laminated menu in front of him. Rosie finally stepped forward from behind the register, wiping her hands on her apron though they were already clean. "Sheriff," she began cautiously, "Mrs. Carter has always sat there. Since before I took over this place." Hayes did not look at Rosie. His focus remained locked on Evelyn, as though acknowledging anyone else would dilute the authority he was trying to project. "Times change," he said. "Policies change." The words sounded rehearsed, yet hollow. Mrs. Carter glanced toward the window again. The American flag continued to wave, bright against the blue sky, unconcerned with the policies of small men. "The Constitution has not changed," she said quietly. The deputy's eyes flickered at that. Sheriff Hayes shifted his stance, boots scraping softly against tile. He was used to compliance, to the quick lowering of eyes, to apologies offered even when none were owed. What unsettled him was not defiance, but composure. Mrs. Carter did not argue. She did not accuse. She simply remained. That steadiness unsettled the room more than raised voices ever could. A bead of perspiration traced down the side of Hayes's temple despite the air conditioning. He reached up briefly, adjusting the collar of his uniform as though it had grown tight. "You think waving old memories around gives you leverage?" he asked. His voice held a faint edge now, less certain. Mrs. Carter allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not mocking, not triumphant. "Memories are not leverage," she said. "They are history." Her gaze did not waver. "And history tends to surface." The envelope lay between them, silent but heavy with implication. Hayes's eyes lingered on it again, and this time he noticed the faint seal pressed into the corner of the paper. It was subtle, almost invisible unless one was looking for it. He swallowed once, then quickly masked the motion by glancing toward the deputy. "Step outside," he instructed quietly. The deputy hesitated, then obeyed, pushing the diner door open. A warm gust of Georgia air slipped inside before the door shut again, bringing with it the distant sound of traffic and the faint toll of the courthouse clock striking 10. Inside, the remaining patrons shifted in their seats, tension easing slightly, but not dissolving. Sheriff Hayes leaned closer to the table, lowering his voice further. "You could avoid unnecessary attention," he said. "Finish your breakfast somewhere else." It was an offer disguised as advice. Mrs. Carter looked down at her untouched eggs, now cooling on the plate. She picked up her fork, steady despite the tremor in her hands, and took a small bite. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if to demonstrate that she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. After swallowing, she placed the fork back on the plate with quiet precision. "Sheriff," she said, her voice as even as the tick of the clock above the pie case. "I have avoided attention my entire life. That is precisely why I am still sitting here." The words hung between them, not loud, not dramatic, but immovable. Outside, the flag caught another strong gust of wind and snapped sharply against its pole, the sound echoing faintly through the glass like a reminder that symbols mean little if they are not defended in small, ordinary places. The fork rested lightly against the edge of the plate after Mrs. Evelyn Carter finished her bite, the faint scrape of metal on ceramic sounding louder than it should have in the strained quiet. Sheriff Daniel Hayes remained leaning toward the table, close enough to cast a shadow across the folded photograph and the unopened envelope. Outside, the sun climbed higher, brightening Main Street and sharpening the reflection of the American flag in the diner window so that its red stripes shimmered faintly across the glass. Inside, the air felt thinner. Hayes straightened again, drawing in a slow breath through his nose as though recalibrating. He was accustomed to compliance, to a town that moved in subtle response to his presence. What unsettled him now was not resistance in the form of raised voices, but resistance in the form of stillness. Mrs. Carter did not fidget. She did not plead. She did not look around for rescue. She simply existed in the space as if it were unquestionably hers. "You are testing my patience," Hayes said at last, his voice low but edged with strain. Mrs. Carter dabbed the corner of her mouth with a neatly folded napkin. "No, Sheriff," she replied evenly. "I am testing nothing. I am eating breakfast." The words landed softly, yet they held their ground. Rosie shifted her weight behind the counter, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light as her fingers gripped the edge of the register. The deputy remained outside the glass door, his silhouette visible through the reflection of the flag, pacing once and then stopping, uncertain whether to intervene or remain invisible. Hayes glanced toward the window, noticing the deputy's reflection overlapping the bright stripes of the flag. The symbolism was uncomfortable, though he would never have admitted that aloud. He leaned in once more, lowering his voice further so that only Mrs. Carter could hear. "There are expectations in this town," he said. "People know their place." Mrs. Carter's gaze did not flinch. "Places change," she answered. "They always have." A faint breeze stirred the small paper flag in the sugar caddy, causing it to tremble slightly. The courthouse clock down the street chimed once, marking the quarter hour. Hayes reached for the photograph on the table but stopped short of touching it. The image of the young soldier in uniform stared back at him, frozen in time, smiling with uncomplicated pride. "You think this gives you protection?" Hayes asked quietly. Mrs. Carter shook her head once. "It gives me perspective." She slid the photograph back toward herself and then, with deliberate calm, turned the envelope so that the seal faced upright. The faint embossing caught the light now, clearer than before. Hayes's eyes narrowed as recognition flickered behind them. He did not speak for several seconds. In that pause, the hum of the ceiling fan grew louder, the smell of coffee sharper. A couple at the far booth exchanged a glance, silent communication passing between them. Hayes straightened fully this time, taking a step back from the table. The movement was small but noticeable. Authority in retreat is always subtle before it is visible. "This is not finished," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. Mrs. Carter reached for her mug and took a slow sip, the steam brushing against her face. "I did not begin anything," she replied. Hayes's jaw tightened, but he did not counter. Instead, he adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder, pressing a button briefly though he did not speak into it. The static crackled and then fell silent. Outside, the deputy stopped pacing and looked toward the courthouse as though anticipating something unseen. Hayes glanced once more at the envelope, at the seal that hinted at offices far beyond the boundaries of this small Georgia town. For the first time that morning, his posture shifted from command to calculation. He turned toward the door, boots striking the tile with less force than before. As he pushed the door open, a rush of warm air entered, carrying with it the distant echo of sirens far down the highway, not urgent, just present. The door closed behind him with a muted thud. Inside the diner, the silence lingered for a long moment before the quiet murmur of forks and cups resumed, tentative at first. Mrs. Carter remained in her seat, shoulders squared, the envelope resting beside her plate like a promise that history, once stirred, does not settle easily. For several long seconds, no one in Rosie's diner moved. The air felt suspended, thick with the weight of words that had not been spoken but had been understood. Sheriff Daniel Hayes remained standing a few feet from the booth, his posture no longer towering but guarded. The second patrol car outside sat quiet at the curb, engine off, sunlight reflecting off its windshield in sharp flashes that cut across the diner walls. Mrs. Evelyn Carter rested her hands lightly over the envelope, her fingers calm despite the faint tremor that age had etched into them. She did not look triumphant. She did not look afraid. She simply looked steady. The courthouse clock down the street began to chime the half hour, each deep tone rolling through the open spaces of Main Street and slipping faintly through the diner glass. Hayes exhaled slowly, as though coming to a decision that had less to do with pride and more to do with consequence. He reached up and adjusted the radio on his shoulder again, but this time he did not press the button. He did not call for anyone. Instead, he lowered his hand and looked directly at Mrs. Carter, not past her, not around her, but at her. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, humming faintly before stabilizing. "You understand," he began, choosing his words carefully, "that this has drawn attention." Mrs. Carter nodded slightly. "Attention is not always a bad thing," she replied. Her voice remained quiet, but it carried clearly across the diner. A few patrons resumed slow bites of food, though their eyes stayed trained on the exchange. Rosie stepped back behind the counter, giving space without leaving. Hayes glanced once more at the envelope, at the faint seal that hinted at offices and corridors far beyond the county line. He had built his authority within the boundaries of this town, within familiar streets and faces. But that seal represented a world measured in federal oversight and national scrutiny. He cleared his throat, the sound softer than before. There are procedures, he said. If there are concerns, they can be addressed properly. The phrasing was different now. No longer commands. Suggestions. Mrs. Carter folded her hands together. Procedures are important, she agreed. So is dignity. The word hung in the air like a bell tone that lingered long after the strike. Outside, the deputy shifted near the cruiser, uncertainty etched into his stance. Hayes noticed it. He noticed the way the room had changed as well. The silence was no longer fearful. It was observant, measured. He took a step back from the booth, increasing the physical distance between himself and the table. It was a small movement, but everyone in the diner felt it. Power had shifted without spectacle. "Finish your meal," he said finally, his voice controlled, stripped of the earlier edge. "We will speak later." It was not a threat. It was not an apology. It was something in between. Mrs. Carter inclined her head once, acknowledging the words without granting them weight. Hayes turned toward the door, boots quieter on the tile this time. The bell chimed again as he stepped outside into the late morning sun. Through the window, the patrons watched as he approached the second patrol car and spoke briefly with the deputy, gestures smaller than before. No raised hands. No dramatic motions. Just conversation. Inside, Rosie slowly exhaled, as though she had been holding her breath for the past 20 minutes. "Your coffee is on the house today," she said softly. Mrs. Carter allowed a faint smile. "I always pay my own way," she replied. She reached into her purse and set exact change on the table, coins aligning neatly beside the envelope. The American flag outside continued its steady rhythm in the wind, bright against the blue sky, indifferent to titles and uniforms. Mrs. Carter picked up her mug one final time, finishing the last warm sip. When she set it down, the sound was gentle, deliberate, final. She did not rush. She did not linger. She simply remained seated for a moment longer, shoulders squared, the quiet embodiment of a history that refused to be pushed aside, while outside on Main Street, authority recalculated under the watchful stripes of red, white, and blue. The diner gradually exhaled after Sheriff Daniel Hayes stepped fully onto the sidewalk, but the calm that returned was different from the calm that had existed before. It was not forgetful. It was watchful. Mrs. Evelyn Carter rose slowly from the booth, smoothing the front of her pale blue cardigan as though straightening not just fabric, but the moment itself. She placed the envelope carefully back into her purse, then slipped the photograph of her husband into the inner pocket where it had rested for years. Outside, Hayes stood beside the second patrol car, speaking in low tones to the deputy. His posture had lost its sharp edges. He glanced once toward the diner window, aware of the eyes behind the glass. Mrs. Carter walked toward the counter, each step measured and unhurried. The floor tiles clicked softly beneath her sensible shoes. Rosie met her halfway, pressing her lips together before offering a small nod that carried more apology than words could manage. "You sure you do not want someone to walk you to your car?" Rosie asked quietly. Mrs. Carter shook her head. "I have walked longer roads than this," she replied. She placed her purse strapped securely over her shoulder and reached for the diner door. The bell chimed again as she stepped into the sunlight. The air outside felt warmer than before, the kind of late summer heat that pressed against the skin but did not overwhelm it. Main Street carried on with cautious normalcy. A delivery truck idled near the hardware store. Two teenagers rode bicycles past the courthouse steps. Life had not stopped, but it had shifted. Hayes turned as she approached the sidewalk. For a brief second, neither spoke. The American flag above City Hall snapped once in a stronger gust of wind, drawing both their eyes upward before returning to each other. "Ma'am," Hayes began, his tone stripped of its earlier certainty. "This town values respect." Mrs. Carter looked at him steadily. "Respect is shown," she answered, "not demanded." The deputy beside him glanced down, shifting his weight. Hayes seemed to search for words that would restore the balance he once felt so sure of, but the weight of the Arlington seal lingered unspoken between them. He gave a short nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped aside to clear the path. It was a small gesture, yet unmistakable. Mrs. Carter walked past him without hurry, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in understanding. She crossed Main Street carefully, the crosswalk lines faded but still visible, and reached her older sedan parked beneath a sycamore tree. The leaves above rustled gently, casting dappled shadows across the windshield. Before opening the driver's door, she paused and looked back down the street. The diner windows reflected the flag once more, bright and steady. Hayes remained near the cruiser, speaking quietly with the deputy, his shoulders less rigid than before. For the first time that morning, the tension in his stance seemed replaced by contemplation. Mrs. Carter opened her car door and settled into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror with calm precision. In the reflection, she saw Main Street framed behind her, the courthouse steps, the flag, and the patrol cars that now looked less imposing beneath the wide Georgia sky. She started the engine, the familiar hum grounding her in routine. As she pulled away from the curb, the sun caught the chrome trim along her hood, sending a brief glint of light across the pavement. She did not accelerate quickly. She did not look back again. On the sidewalk, Hayes watched the sedan disappear down the block, the faint hum of its engine fading into the late morning air. The deputy cleared his throat softly. "Sir," he asked. Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes lifted once more to the American flag moving steadily above City Hall. The breeze had not changed. Only the understanding beneath it had. In that quiet stretch of Main Street, authority no longer felt unquestioned. It felt observed. And for the first time that morning, the weight of that observation settled fully on his shoulders. By early afternoon, the story had already begun to travel beyond Main Street, not through shouting or spectacle, but through quiet calls and careful words. Sheriff Daniel Hayes stood inside his office at the red brick station beside the courthouse, the blinds half drawn against the Georgia sun. Dust floated in thin beams of light across framed commendations on the wall. The silver star pinned to his chest earlier that morning now rested on his desk beside a stack of incident reports. He had removed it without fully realizing he had done so. On his desk sat a landline phone, receiver slightly askew from being lifted and replaced more than once. Across town, Mrs. Evelyn Carter had returned home, her small white house tucked beneath tall pines at the edge of a quiet neighborhood that had seen decades of change. She set her purse on the kitchen table and carefully removed the envelope once more, smoothing its edges with her fingertips. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. A clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily, unbothered by the weight of the morning. The phone on her counter rang, not loudly, but firmly. She paused before answering, as though she had expected the call all along. "Mama," came the voice on the other end, deep and controlled, carrying both distance and familiarity. Marcus Carter had not lost the softness in his tone despite years spent navigating corridors of power in Washington. "I heard." She did not ask how. She did not need to. Information moved quickly in certain circles. "It was handled," she replied simply. On the other end, there was a pause. "Was it?" Marcus asked. Back at the station, Hayes stared at a document now open in front of him. It had arrived by secure fax less than an hour earlier, bearing a header that carried weight far beyond county lines. It was not an accusation. It was not a threat. It was a request for clarification regarding a report that had been forwarded through appropriate channels. The language was measured, official, and unmistakable. Hayes ran a hand slowly over his jaw, feeling the faint rasp of afternoon stubble. He had operated within familiar authority for years, but this letter introduced oversight from a level he could not ignore. Outside his office, deputies moved quietly, the usual laughter absent. Back in her kitchen, Mrs. Carter leaned against the counter, gazing out the small window toward her backyard where a single American flag stood near the fence, planted beside her husband's memorial stone. The fabric moved gently in the warm breeze. "I do not want escalation," she said calmly into the phone. "I want understanding." Marcus exhaled softly. "Understanding requires accountability," he replied. She closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in reflection. "Then let accountability come in the right way," she said. At the station, Hayes picked up the silver star from his desk and held it in his palm. It felt heavier than usual. He thought about the booth at the diner, about the photograph of the young soldier, about the envelope with the Arlington seal. Authority, he realized, was not insulated from consequence simply because it was local. He set the badge back down carefully and reached for the phone once more, dialing a number with deliberate precision. The courthouse clock struck 3, each chime echoing across Main Street. In her quiet kitchen, Mrs. Carter ended the call and returned the envelope to her purse. She did not smile. She did not look satisfied. She looked resolved. Outside her window, the afternoon light softened, casting long shadows across the yard. In his office, Hayes straightened his uniform jacket and prepared for a meeting he had not expected to have that morning. Across town, beneath two different flags moving in the same breeze, the balance of authority had shifted from assumption to examination, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the steady weight of accountability approaching on measured steps. The meeting at the courthouse the following morning did not involve raised voices or flashing cameras. It involved long tables, polished wood, and careful words spoken at measured volume. Sheriff Daniel Hayes sat at one end of the conference room, his uniform pressed as always, though the silver star on his chest seemed to reflect less light than it once had. Across from him sat representatives from the State Oversight Board and a quiet man in a dark suit who had driven down from Atlanta at the request of a federal office that preferred discretion over headlines. Through the tall courthouse windows, the American flag moved steadily in the late morning breeze, visible to everyone inside whether they intended to look at it or not. Hayes listened as the events at the diner were reviewed without embellishment. There were no accusations shouted across the table, only questions that required clear answers. He responded carefully, his tone professional, aware that each word now carried weight beyond Main Street. In a small white house beneath tall pines, Mrs. Evelyn Carter watered the rosebush near her front porch, the hose coiled loosely at her feet. Sunlight filtered through the branches above, dappling the wooden steps with shifting patches of gold. She did not check the news. She did not sit by the phone. She had said what she needed to say the day before. The rest would unfold without her presence. Back at the courthouse, the quiet man from Atlanta placed a document on the table, outlining a formal review of conduct and community policy. It was thorough but not theatrical. Hayes read each line slowly, aware that authority was strongest when aligned with accountability and weakest when it resisted it. He signed the acknowledgement without argument. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a practical one. Outside, townspeople moved along the sidewalks, unaware of the precise wording being discussed behind closed doors, but sensing that something had shifted. By late afternoon, Hayes stepped out of the courthouse and paused at the top of the steps. The air felt different, lighter yet heavier with meaning. He looked down Main Street toward Rosie's Diner, where the neon sign flickered on as evening approached. Inside the diner, conversations flowed more freely than they had the day before. Rosie wiped down the corner booth by the window, smoothing the laminated surface until it shone under the lights. The following Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the sky stretching wide over the courthouse and the small line of shops along Main Street. Mrs. Carter parked her older sedan beneath the same sycamore tree and walked toward the diner with steady steps. The bell chimed as she entered, and this time the sound felt ordinary. She took her seat at the booth by the window without interruption. The American flag outside lifted and fell in its steady rhythm. A few patrons nodded politely in her direction. No one looked away. Sheriff Hayes entered the diner several minutes later, not in haste, not in command, but in routine. He paused when he saw her seated there. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He removed his hat, a simple gesture, and inclined his head. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he said evenly. She returned the nod. "Good morning, Sheriff." There was no applause, no dramatic silence, only the quiet clink of dishes and the hum of conversation continuing around them. Hayes ordered his coffee and took a seat at the counter rather than standing over any table. Outside, the flag moved in the same breeze that had stirred it all week, bright against the blue Georgia